We begin with the very latest in President Trump's former lawyer implicating him in his guilty plea yesterday. Trump appeared to acknowledge his attorney's campaign finance violation and then walked it back in an interview, all while maintaining it's not a crime, and said he blamed Attorney General Jeff Sessions for his former lawyer's prosecution. The president tweeted, Michael Cohen pled guilty to 2 counts of campaign finance violations that are not a crime. Now, what time was that tweet, Alex? Yeah.
In the morning, about 9:37
in the morning. Okay. So then President Obama had a big campaign finance violation, and it was easily settled. Yes, he talked about that. Trump was referring to a late filing on small dollar donations by the Obama campaign, which resulted in a large fine given the scale of the operation, but is different than knowingly concealing campaign spending as pleaded to by Cohen, and which is routinely prosecuted in criminal court, as with the fraud case against John Edwards under the Obama Justice Department. Speaking, of course, to Fox News, that's where I told you he'd go, President Trump said it had nothing to do with who is leading DOJ. It has everything to do with it.
My first question when I heard about it was, did they come out of the campaign? Because that could be a little dicey. And they didn't come out of the campaign, and that's big. But they weren't. It's not even a campaign violation. If you look at President Obama, he had a massive campaign violation, but he had a different attorney general, and they viewed it a lot differently.
Ben Wittes, try to make sense of all the things that he's piling onto this answer here. Can you make a parallel between violations, the one that he's talking about in the Obama administration, and the payoff to a porn star and a Playboy bunny made right before, I believe, the election was going into full bore?
Well, to ask that question that way is, is the answer to it. So, look, the part of what the president says, the only part that's true, is that it is the case that normal campaign finance violations are handed routinely by the Federal Election Commission as a civil matter. And there's a system, like with any regulatory system, of penalties and fines, and those are handled as routine matters and don't invoke criminal offenses. When you engage in an elaborate scheme, on the other hand, to circumvent those regulatory requirements by hiding things, by paying people hush money, by not then reporting those hush money payments as campaign contributions, you're going to invoke criminal authorities, or at least you may. And that is the difference between the what he calls massive campaign finance problems that the Obama administration had, the campaign had, which was some technical filing errors for which they paid a fine, and a scheme to get your personal lawyer to get tabloids or other entities to pay off former mistresses or paramours before the election to keep them quiet. There's no comparison to be drawn there.
There's none. It's flabbergasting. The entire interview, for many reasons, is actually staggering at this point. And the fact that he thinks he can push things along by just mushing the truth into complete drivel, actually. He doesn't even make sense at times. Donnie, I've been thinking all day yesterday about Michael Cohen and all the witches that so far have been, brought in by Mueller, pled guilty or indicted. And if you look at what Michael Cohen has pled guilty to, how stupid do these people, how stupid are these people? Don't they know what is going to happen if they have committed these crimes, if they're pleading guilty to these actions? How did they not know that they wouldn't be hauled in at this point? And the next question will be, how stupid are Republicans at this point to still stand by this president, to stand by all of this and say nothing? Look at, we don't even have enough room on the screen. Pleading guilty, pleading guilty, pleading guilty, pleading guilty. How stupid are these people to think that it wouldn't end like this?
Let's unpack this stupid suitcase, okay? Because there's a lot of linen in there. Starting with Trump, when you watch that...
It's Michael Cohen. I'm really... tell me about Michael
I'll get
Cohen.
to Cohen in a
Explain
second.
this man to me. You're friends with him.
I'm friends. I'm going to get back to... Just step back for a second and get into Cohen. What's amazing about that Trump interview, he says, when I first found out about this, I was making sure, did this come from campaign? Like, there's not a tape that exists of him directing Michael Cohen to say, do it in cash, like when he just found out about it. It's just like, that doesn't exist. That audio doesn't exist. We haven't heard it. That's what's astounding. As far as Cohen, Cohen was an attorney working for Trump. And you're directed by your boss, and it's not, I'm not using the Nuremberg explanation, but it's just, I don't think at that point you're saying to yourself, should I do this, should I not do this? You're a lawyer, you're working for, and he has stood up and he's facing the consequences. I think I'm going to stay with the stupid place in the case of Trump and the Republicans and that very brave gentleman, Mitch McConnell, who, you are the leader of the Republican Party. Okay, you are the face, other than after the president. You are it. You go down the totem pole, that PP pole, and there it is. And the president's personal attorney has pleaded guilty to taking directions violating a felonious law, and you have no comment. You have no comment. And John, we're going to stay in the kind of the stupid universe. What does Mitch McConnell think when he thinks people are watching? Do you think people go, oh, we won't ask you again? That's okay?
No, I think what he thinks is they're in hell. Their whole hope is just that they are productive enough and serve the interests of enough voters that they can spare themselves disaster in November. The timeline is very short here for them. It's from here till the November elections. Tailwinds are looking very bad for them. If they can just focus on their work, ignore Trump, get judges, get Brett Kavanaugh confirmed, Paul Ryan then gets to retire, Mitch McConnell can say, I did all this, I have nothing to do with this guy. So he doesn't want to talk about it because there is nothing in it for him in terms of this timeline from now until November to say a single word about Trump, about Cohen, about Manafort, about Mueller. He is in a lockbox. Anything he says is a disaster. If he says, I no longer support Trump, the Republican base turns on him. If he says, I support Trump, he sells his soul. His wife is in the cabinet. It's not good, so he just keeps his mouth shut.
Mika, let me ask a stupid question since we're on the stupid line to John's point about, well, let's do business as usual, because if we do business and business is okay. The reality, though, in going to that Fox poll is that basically, and this the signature work of the Trump administration so far has been the tax plan. That is 11% less popular than the signature work of the Obama administration, which is, of course, Obamacare. You take the enthusiasm polls, you take optimism for the next generation, which is down 11 points. That's always going in the right direction. You take the president underwater, and you take, other than core Republicans, nobody else thinks the economy is going in the right direction. So it's hard for them to run on business as usual at this point.
Look, we've got so much to cover and so much more to get to, but I will say it is flabbergasting how stupid Michael Cohen and the other witches are that we have covered in this witch hunt, which I'll use the president's word. I don't get the Republican Party at this point because they're leaders, and it's about right and wrong. It's about the fabric of this country.
They're not leaders.
It's about the truth, and they're not leaders, and they're letting Americans down.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.